Welcome to Sex is Medicine, your number one resource for holistic sex education. I'm Devi Erickson, and I invite you to join me every week for another enriching and powerful conversation about the intersection of sexuality, spirituality, pleasure, and personal growth. Each episode of Sex is Medicine is dedicated to awakening your heart and mind to the true purpose and power of human sexuality. Please join me on this journey of self-discovery as we explore the art of using pleasure as medicine to awaken, heal, and empower every area of your life. Sex is Medicine broadcasts every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific on Contact Talk Radio Network. You can listen to the replay and subscribe to Sex is Medicine on Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. And now get ready for another episode of Sex is Medicine. Hey everybody, welcome to Sex is Medicine. I am your host, Miss Devi Erickson, here with you for another juicy and enriching episode where we explore the intersection of sexuality, spirituality, pleasure, and personal growth. I am here this evening with my friend and Sex is Medicine alumni, Mel Cassidy of the Monogamy Detox, my wonderful polyamory expert, ethical polyamory, a trauma-informed polyamory, very important. And today we're going to talk about the historical roots of Neo-Tantra. So you hear me talk about it quite a bit, my angst with the whole Neo-Tantra realm. And Mel is a friend of mine because she shares similar angst about it. And the reason for that is because we were both trained in lineage-based styles of Tantra. So Mel was trained in Hindu-based style of Tantra. I'm trained in a Tibetan Buddhist lineage of Tantra. And so, you know, not everything I do is Tibetan Buddhist. And the Tantra that I do is rooted in Tibetan Buddhism. And so both of us being anchored literally and rooted in these lineage-based practices, when we met, it was kind of like, what the fuck is going on? What is this other stuff? So Mel was over at my house a few months ago, and we were standing in the kitchen by the fridge. I remember this. And Mel started kicking down the historical roots of Neo-Tantra. And I'm like, what? How come? Because people, the way Neo-Tantra is presented, it's just like, oh, I went to a workshop in India and now I'm a Tantrika, whatever. And so there isn't a conversation or even general knowledge about, quite frankly, the very insidious roots of Neo-Tantra. And so Mel has the down low on all of this. And it makes so much sense when you understand where this shit is coming from. You understand why it manifests the way it manifests here and today. So Mel Cassidy, thank you for joining us for this illustrious and enlightening conversation about the historical roots of Neo-Tantra. So tell us, if you're open to telling us the roots of your lineage, because I always mispronounce it, so I don't try to even pronounce it. I'm like Shiva, Shaivite, whatever it is.
So the lineage that I grew up in is one of the Tantra lineages that is not sex focused. It definitely has, it talks about sexuality and the sacredness of it, but it's not sex focused. And it's rooted in Kashmir Shaivism. Okay. So Kashmir Shaivism is a particular flavor of Tantra that emerged in Kashmir, which is the often disputed province between India and Pakistan. And there's some really incredible, beautiful teachings in Kashmir Shaivism. It's considered to be a non-dualistic philosophy and set of practices. So rather than separating things into binaries such as male and female, you learn to look beyond that. And, growing up with that tradition, like as a teenager, I was studying Sanskrit texts. I would go to the ashram, I'd be on retreat. I had the incredible privilege to learn from a living master and learn from the teachers who she has empowered to continue the teaching. And, learning this form of Tantra, which is a life practice. And then that was my experience as a teenager. And then as an adult, I was in a relationship with someone who was all into Tantra. And I was like, cool, but wait, what are you talking about? what are you talking about? Like what you're practicing sounds like it's going to emphasize the duality. To me, Tantra is about transcending duality. I don't understand what's going on here. And, I came out of that relationship with I would say some baggage around sex because of what he interpreted tantric sex to be, which I now know is a gross misinterpretation of what certainly with your tradition teach. And I got really curious about what is this? Like, what is it that people are talking about with Tantra? Because it doesn't resemble what I know as Tantra. Like, to me, this is a profound spiritual practice that borders on poetic quantum physics. Like, and it's lineage based, right? Like I have a living master who exists in this world. And because there is a living lineage, that means that she can adapt the teachings and she can make them accessible and modernize them. But they are still rooted in that tradition. And we're still learning the Sanskrit. We're still learning the origins of the tradition while also learning how to bring them to life in the modern day. And when I started looking at all these, different books on Neo-Tantra and looking at workshops in Neo-Tantra, I mean, nobody was calling it Neo-Tantra then. Some
it was just Tantra.
Yeah, it was just Tantra. And like, kudos to the practitioners who are doing the work to differentiate, who understand the appropriation that's gone on. But looking at these Tantra workshops and going, well, what lineage are you? Who did you learn this from? Where are the origins of this lineage? And asking questions like that and being met with blank expressions. And I was like, okay, there's something more going on here. And I really want to know more.
Yeah, and I as I shared on my episode from last week, and then in summits and whatever, is like in terms of Tantra, where I was coming out of Kauai, this little concentrated bubble, this little tiny island in the middle of the ocean. I had very little exposure to Tantra before. And so when I was initiated, so to speak, or introduced to this, it was under this umbrella of these sacred lineage-based teachings that Kalu Rinpoche had given to Lama Tashi and had never given to a Westerner before. And it was all like these secret teachings for harnessing sexual energy and using it for healing and realization and enlightenment. And it was like just rooted in this spiritual tradition. And it was all about using sexuality, yes, for pleasure, but healing through that pleasure and realizing our ultimate bliss nature through that pleasure. And every orgasm is a glimpse of enlightenment. And, and it's not just about these like physical things. And that's not about these breath things. It's actually visualizing shit. Like when I'm practicing sexual deity Tantra yoga, I'm emanating as the deity. I've got the whole freaking universe emanating as the deity. I've got a heart mantra spinning, shooting rainbow light out into all directions. I got things moving up and down my central channel. Like, it's complicated shit. So it's like you got a whole orchestra going on and you're orgasming at the same time. Right? So all of this stuff, and it's all for elevating, expanding, and ultimately purifying everything that obscures us and blocks us from being healthy, happy, mature human beings. That's what I love about the way my Lama teaches. He's like, enlightenment is just about being a mature human being. That's all it is. That's what it means. It's your birthright, right? Yeah. So that was my understanding of sexual Tantra, my training of sexual Tantra. So I come out of this little tiny island and I hit Vancouver, and all of a sudden it's like, I'm like, hey, I offer Tantra coaching. I'm expecting to walk people through meditations and, and some sexual healing practices. And I'm getting calls for erotic massages. Not that there's anything wrong with an erotic massage, but it's not the same as Tantra. So I was confused. I'm like, how does Tantra, because my Lama didn't teach me about erotic massages. Like that's, and not that sensuality and eroticism can't be part of Tantra. It actually is in Buddhist Tantra specifically. It's rich and gritty and feminine and passionate and blood and sweat and come and drink it. And right. It's hot and passionate, and it's not, an hour-long sensual massage, right? Yeah. It's not the same thing. So I was confused, quite frankly.
Well, and what comes to mind for me is that I mean, I have to, say I'm not a scholar. I am just a student of the lineage that I have practiced within. But what comes to mind to me is the importance of having that lineage. Yeah. Like you were saying, like people go take a workshop, maybe not even India, maybe they take a workshop in Vancouver, and they're like, okay, now I know Tantra. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you've been doing this for a year. Like, every Tantra lineage, doesn't matter whether you're part of a Tibetan lineage or a Hindu lineage or one of the other, milieu of branches of Tantra, you do not become a Tantra master in such a short space of time, unless you have already accumulated tons of merit in past lifetimes and so on and so forth. Like, it is a very, very rare thing for that to happen. And, I know in my own lineage, there are examples of people having the experience of awakening to that liberation potential and mistaking that for, aha, I'm now enlightened. And then they have announced themselves as their own teacher. And the thing is, and like, I know, I'm sure your lineage teaches this too, like when you are doing these practices without the blessing of the lineage, without the grounding in the practices yourself, it actually creates sickness.
Yes.
And sickness is not necessarily, viruses and bacteria and that kind of sickness, because those are real forms of sickness, but this is a sickness in the nervous system. This is a sickness in the energy of the body.
Yep.
And, I think of Neo-Tantra practitioners I've talked to who have suddenly gotten incredibly sick and they can't understand what's going on. And they wonder why. And I'm like, well, maybe, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but maybe there's something here where something in your practice hasn't been grounded.
Mm-hmm. We call that practice of wrong religion. It's one of the 8 primary causes of illness. And so you're exactly right. It may not manifest physically, or maybe it will, but energy imbalances, chronic fatigue, and different forms of psychosis.
Yes.
Emotional imbalance. It's something that I see a lot of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I find it heartbreaking because so many people who've been drawn to Neo-Tantra are drawn to it for good reason.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we live in a culture that has a very messed up relationship to sexuality, to spirituality, to self-care, to liberation, right? That like, and Tantra offers solutions for all of those things.
Yeah.
So this
authentic Tantra does.
Yes.
Real Tantra does. Yes.
And I think Neo-Tantra attempts to.
Yeah.
And so like, I don't want to berate the people who are practicing this or who have practiced or who have, endeavored to make their career teaching Neo-Tantra, because I think like, I want to recognize the good intention that goes into that. And, we're all suffering, this sort of situation of Neo-Tantra suffers from its maladapted origins.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And that's a great segue to go into the origins. But before we dive into that, I do want to capitalize or I want to, expand upon what you were just sharing about, like, not vilifying those folks who practice Neo-Tantra. And I'm in agreement. I know I speak out about it strongly. And part of it is because it is so misrepresented. And because I am a Tantra teacher, I have to confront this all the frickin' time. And I have to confront, every interview. It's like, oh, can you talk about sex magic? There's no fucking thing as sex magic in our lineage. It's focus on enlightenment. You focus on, the bliss of the orgasm and, release your attachment to it. We're not manifesting fucking cars with this. That's not why the Buddha gave us these teachings, so that you could have a nice fucking car, right? So that kind of pisses me off because I have to deal with that shit. But I do also want to address something that is important in the field, is that when I'm usually talking about, Neo-Tantra in a negative way, I'm usually talking about, I'm going to just be real, like the white folk or the non-people of color folk who read a book or took a workshop and they're appropriating it. What I have seen from the Black women teaching Tantra, because there are some hella potent Black women out there teaching Tantra, and they got what they could from the Neo-Tantra world because that's all that was available. And what I have seen them do is I have seen them take these methods and transform them into medicine. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of poison that we will get into in the realm of, like, you know, non-people of color Neo-Tantra. There's a lot of poison in that realm. And I've seen several powerful Black women take those teachings and turn them into healing practices for their communities and for communities of color. So I do want to say that there is beautiful alchemy that's occurring by people who have the correct motivation. They're not trying to capitalize. They're trying to bring healing to their communities with whatever tools they have available to them. And I so admire that.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the note of the appropriation, I know we're going to dive into like how this all began, but one of the things that I look for when I'm like questioning, is someone doing this from an authentic place, or are they doing this from a place where they've been appropriating, is look for a conflation of different language. Mm-hmm. So like I was in a course and, you know, we're reading a book, and the author, who was a white person, I won't name the book, but the author is in one paragraph using Taoist terminology like yin and yang, and then in another paragraph is using Sanskrit terminology, kundalini. And I was like, whoa, this is like, yes, there is a space for integration and mixing, but you're not contextualizing these. Exactly. And when it comes to using kundalini, this is the piece that like hurts my soul. Kundalini is a goddess in the Hindu and tantric pantheon that I know of. Like Kundalini is her own goddess in her own right. Sexuality is one aspect of Kundalini Shakti. It is not the totality of what she represents or who she is. And so many Neo-Tantric texts reduce Kundalini to being your sexual energy. Mm-hmm. And that reduction takes away from the experience mm-hmm. of what these incredible ancient teachings are wanting to convey.
Yeah.
So that's a specific red flag, that if Kundalini is being talked about as a thing rather than as a deity, that's one of those places where I'm like, what's going on here?
And so thank you for sharing that, because this is another difference in traditions when you're doing, you know, lineage-based Tantra. So I've been confused this whole time. I'm like, why the fuck are people talking about Kundalini? Like, what is that? So I asked my Lama, I'm like, Lama Tashi, could you tell me about Kundalini? He's like, oh, just stay away from it. Like, what is it? He's like, oh, it's just fire element energy. People don't know how to work with it. Just stay away from it. So I'm like, okay, so in our tradition, Kundalini is fire element energy. He's like, yeah, you do it. You activate every time you do fire element meditation. It's in every cell of your body. You got all these channels. It's just fire element energy. People just don't know what the fuck they're doing. So it's just like, so that drives me crazy when I'm getting asked to do interviews and they're like, talk about Kundalini. I'm like,
that's from a different aspect of the tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't even know what it is. So you better call Mel, because I had no idea that Kundalini was a goddess. Right? You just want this because it's, you know, it's the trendy, it's the kitsch, it's the I don't know, the media soundbite style of Tantra that is like, oh, marketable. Yeah. But like the actual life essence of it, like that right there, Kundalini is a goddess in that tradition. In our tradition, it's fire element energy. And that's also a Dakini. That's also a realized being, the fire element Dakini, right? And so when we're working with the fire element energy, we are invoking the wisdom aspect of that Dakini. And fire element is the antidote to attachment. It has the power and activity of magnetizing. That's where all that sex magic bullshit comes in, right? If your fire element is active and strong, you're going to have the ability to magnetize and attract, not at the moment of orgasm, but at every waking moment. You'll think a thing and it will manifest, right? Because that is the power of fire element energy in every cell of your body. It doesn't just live in your genitals. It lives in every cell. It awakens the wisdom of discernment. It generates the quality and the energy of bliss. And it governs our sexual reproductive system. There's this whole system of healing associated with the fire element intelligence, not just this groovy, like, hey, awaken the serpent energy in your spine and have great orgasms.
Yeah.
Drives me crazy. So let's talk about how we got here. What the fuck happened?
Okay. So I'm going to put on my history buff hat for a second. And let's just talk about like the 1800s in in England. This is specifically the British Empire. This is the psychology we want to go into. And this is something I'm unfortunately very familiar with, because I spent my early childhood in England, and I, they attempted to indoctrinate me in colonialism. Thankfully, they failed. But Victorian England was this, it's the Industrial Revolution going on. So there's a lot of social change happening, but at the same time, there's a kind of prudishness that has set in. Prior to Queen Victoria, there had been this incredible Renaissance, and there had been a lot of sexual openness. And for whatever reason, maybe it was because we didn't understand how sexually transmitted diseases happened. Maybe it was just like the pushback, that pendulum swing. Under Victoria's rule, things became a lot more prudish, like to the point where if a woman was showing her ankles, that was scandalous. All right. You saw a gentleman you liked, you wanted to flirt with him, you'd lift your skirt up and show him your ankle.
Oh, wait, can I pause you here though? What about all those, weren't they wearing their boobs all up? Was that Victorian too?
That kind of comes and goes, and that would also depend on status and so forth. And there's like acceptable ways to do that. And yeah. But yeah,
that was like this angle thing.
Hypocrisy.
Because I'm looking at, when I'm watching period pieces, I'm looking at the titties. I'm just saying. Yeah. So an ankle was considered flirting. I don't know what they consider the bosom to be.
And it's interesting, because Queen Victoria herself apparently had a very healthy sex life, but she was quite scandalized by a lot of things. And so things became a little more rigid and restricted. At the same time, Britain is going out and colonizing the world and building its empire. As my grandfather put it, he's like, I know why the British had to create an empire, because it was so boring at home. This is my Greek grandfather. That was his commentary after visiting England the first time. And not to dismiss England. England has a lot of beautiful nature and people, but there was this excitement about getting to explore these completely different worlds. And, Europe itself is, centuries of Christianity, which also has its own elements of puritanical stuff in it and sexual restriction. And so these adventurers and colonizers from Europe, and specifically from Britain, arrive in the Orient. And so we have to remember that back then, the Orient is just the blanket term that referred to everything from the Middle East through the Indian subcontinent through to Asia. That's a lot of the world just gets called the Orient.
It's the non-British world, essentially.
Basically.
Where the brown people live. The brown people live in the Orient.
It's the heathens. It's the non-Christians. And there was a fetishism that arose around the Orient, because it's so different. Even the fabrics are different. The way of dressing is different. The cultural norms are completely different. People live in family in a different way. The government is structured in a different way. The religions are completely different. You're going from monotheistic religions in Europe to these pantheistic traditions throughout this whole Orient. Maybe not so much the Middle East, but once you get to India, you've got a whole pantheon. And that was arousing for these British explorers. And so you have this fetishization of the Orient. There's a picture of my Irish great-great-grandfather dressed as a Chinaman, right? And this was something that people would do in the Victorian times. You'd go to the photographer's studio and you would dress up in these Oriental clothes to this is what you do for fun with your friends. And we cringe at this because we're like, oh my God, that's so terrible. And so
wearing blackface, right? Yeah. It's so inappropriate. Yes.
and there's this photograph of him with his buddies being like, ha, 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 we look like Chinamen. And it's just like, oh God, no. So along with all this, there was this fascination in the spirituality that was coming in from all these different parts of the Indian subcontinent and Asia. And you have in the midst of this a few different white men who come along and basically start wanting to learn. And, what I found out about with this information comes from a scholar called Hugh Urban, who's written a couple of books about the origins of Tantra. So like, this is not research I've done on myself. I'm just repeating what I've read. And he focuses on two particular characters. One was a fellow who nicknamed himself the Omnipotent and the other was someone who you may have heard about, a fellow called Alistair Crowley. Now, Alistair Crowley is a name I'd encountered before. As I mentioned, I had this partner who was really into doing Tantra, and he was also fascinated with Alistair Crowley. And so Alistair Crowley is seen as this this sort of like the OG white magician character. He went and studied all sorts of esoterica and different hidden spiritual paths and secret knowledge and so forth, and then kind of like glued it all together in a sort of Frankenstein pastiche of things. And, it's not that what he studied was inaccurate, like he studied Kabbalistic terminology and developed a whole tarot deck and like wrote extensively about that. But he had what I would say dark motivation. And so there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and stories that say that Alistair Crowley was using both his positional power as like the head of a new cult, the OTO, the Order Temporalis Orientalis, and the sacred knowledge that he was learning from different traditions to abuse people and to sexually abuse people. So there are numerous accounts where, he would create rituals where women, sometimes boys too, who were underage, would be forced into sex, would basically be raped. Mm-hmm. And
all under the auspices of Tantra.
All under the auspices of this tantric practice. And so when, people are talking about sex magic practices, that's what they're referring to. It's this stuff that originates from a white man, an abusive, harmful white man, going and studying these sacred teachings. Like, I don't know if it's the same in your tradition, but like, I know within Kashmir Shaivism, like a student might have to do labor and work for years before the teacher would actually impart the sacred knowledge to them. Like they'd have to prove their worth. And somehow he'd gotten a hold of the texts and didn't have a living teacher, didn't have a living lineage to ground him, and just went on this path of basically stealing the practices and then morphing them and gluing them to other things that he was doing in order to harm.
And so what's a few things are coming to me from this. So Tantra, at least in our lineage, is something that you do. It's not something that you read and intellectualize and mentally masturbate about. It is yoga. And so you can read 100 fucking books on Tantra and know absolutely nothing about Tantra because it's not a head thing. It's not an intellectual, rational understanding. It's an embodied wisdom practice. And when you're doing authentic Tantra, wisdom arises from the inside out. So that's the first thing. It's like, I don't care how many books he read. If he's reading them through the lens of poison, the only thing he's going to produce is poison. If there's no realization, then of course it's going to be this cobbling together of this misconstrued, misinterpreted stuff because he has no wisdom arising. Yeah. The other thing that occurs to me is incorrect motivation. You go to the hell realms. Your karma, you will fuck your shit up if you are practicing stealing shit from these traditions and then repackaging and repurposing it with incorrect motivation. Yeah. I mean, that is the karmic repercussions of that are extraordinary. Apparently he didn't read that part in all the texts he was reading.
Or right? He read it and thought that, in his grandiosity that he was above that.
In his arrogance. So what you're saying right now, like this is all the root poison of arrogance. which is a poison, which causes psychosis, which is the root poison of arrogance, is what narcissism is rooted in, which leads to all kinds of abuses. And this we can trace to like, some of the current shit that has occurred in the field of Neo-Tantra. I mean, there are some really well-known Tantra schools that I'm like, I don't know how y'all are not in jail because the prolific sexual abuse.
Well, and that's one of the things I look at. I'm in a lot of the same groups as you, like with sex educators and Tantra people, and it feels like there's another call out every week or another warning about some group or some teacher. And, I follow the work of B. Schofield. I think they're incredible. And I'm so grateful for the work that they do researching and like sometimes going undercover in some of these organizations and the abuse in Neo-Tantra is endemic.
Yeah.
And I sit back as an observer and go like, have y'all looked at what might be in common here? Like maybe, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but maybe it's just possible that there is a draw towards these abusive behaviors because the origins of this Neo-Tantra lineage, for lack of a better term, come from a place that was designed for abuse and harm.
So let's just nail that down and pin it so our audience knows. So what the television companies are calling me to do. What Western mainstream believes is Tantra actually originated with Alistair Crowley sexually abusing boys and men, ritualistically sexually abusing them and calling it Tantra. That's what they're trying. That's what Neo-Tantra is.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I look at all these other pieces that Neo-Tantra does, like so many groups. It's like, oh, the sacred masculine, divine feminine, and all of that. And I'm like, yes, those are phenomenon. Those are things, like we can talk about that, but also like if we get rigid in that, you're losing the point. Like Tantra is about transcendence. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I love about the work that you do is you make it accessible for people who are non-binary, who are trans, who don't conform to rigid gendered identities. Because it's about what are you working with?
Yeah.
What does your body have and how are you cultivating that? And a lot of Neo-Tantra has no space for that. A lot of Neo-Tantra, and this is not universal, that there are some teachers who have done an incredible job of adapting and being inclusive, but a lot of it is still very cis and heteronormative. And I see that and I experience that myself as someone who's queer. I experience that as part of the poison.
That's violence.
Yeah, it's a form of harm that's saying, no, we're going to polarize you and we're going to separate you. And that separation is a wounding.
Yeah. And where I encountered this is, I'm going to call out a name, David Data's work. Like when I first came out of Kauai to Vancouver, everyone's talking about David Data. I'm like, well, who's his teacher and what's his lineage? Like, I mean, Adida, who was a fucking sexual abuser. I mean, that's where that shit came from, right? It came out of a cesspool of abuse and the constant, like the masculine essence of again, that my understanding was like feminine essence is relative reality. And it's, the feminine energy is what manifests in form. The masculine energy is conceptual. They are an inseparable union. You cannot have one without the other. They are fucking on top of your head all the time.
And they both exist within you.
Yeah. And sometimes you imagine yourself as a male type deity, a penis deity, and sometimes you imagine yourself with a yoni deity. And in terms of Tantra, who it's appropriate for is anybody with a human nervous system. That's it. That's not, your genitals are irrelevant. Like, we could give a shit. I just need to know, like, if I'm teaching you linga massage or yoni massage, like, do you have labia or do you have a scrotum? That's all I need to know. But the Tantra is for anyone with a human nervous system.
Yeah. So there's so much that's going on in there. And I, I get afraid to speak up about it because I'm like, I don't have these like Tantra teacher credentials. I am not a teacher in my own lineage. I am just a student. I just know what I know, and I know my experience. But it's this that sense, like when you've grown up with something. I mean, literally, like I met my teacher for the first time when I was 2 years old, and I remember it. When you've grown up with a practice, you can feel it in your gut when something isn't right. And so trying to like figure out, well, what is it? And what I find really heartbreaking is seeing so many people moving towards it with a genuine desire. They're genuine seekers. They are looking for solutions. They are looking for answers. They're wanting to heal themselves. And they end up in this Neo-Tantra realm where there isn't the same kind of lineage accountability. There isn't the same level of awareness of what's actually happening. Like, I mean, I've had conversations with some Tantra teachers where I'm like, I'll ask them questions about what's happening energetically in a practice and they can't answer. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, like, no, like if you're teaching this, you have to have a deeper understanding, I'm sure. And you have to be able to adapt to where a student is at. And there is a reason why in these lineage practices that you and I have that you don't like, not everything is revealed right away.
Nope.
There are always teachings that are kept back until the student is ready.
Yeah.
And they might be imparted in person, they might be imparted in a vision, or they might be imparted suddenly to everybody publicly, but like you don't get everything all at once. Mm-hmm. And so, there's Tantra retreats and conferences and things like that. And that's a lot for the nervous system to experience. Whereas, what I know through this Kashmir Shaivism practice is my experience of Tantra is much more closer to somatics. Yeah. It is that like we're working with the nervous system, we're working with our bodies. This is about an embodiment experience. And don't push yourself. Don't force yourself to go somewhere where you're not ready. Don't exhaust yourself. Like you have to tune into yourself and listen. And a lot of the Neo-Tantra environments don't seem to do that. They want to get you high on an experience and get you into the next experience and get you into the next experience. And there's this risk of like, you go chasing the high. And then that becomes a poison in of itself. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And again, isn't that, sorry, Biniaka, sorry.
Biniaka wants to be part of this conversation.
I contribute to the conversation. So even that seeking, that's you're seeking an exalted experience. That's the antithesis of Tantra. Like we call those rainbow experiences. And like, if I did like, I go to my lama's like, I had a great experience. He's like, great. That sounds like a nice experience. Don't lose your focus. It's like, the difference between experience and realization, like you were talking about earlier, when some of us Tantra teachers have a really incredible experience and think we're enlightened. Experience is very different than realization. Experiences go away. Realization does not. Realization anchors in the form. Experience is a nice like gateway drug to what's possible, but it's not the same as realization. And going to Tantra festivals and chasing these rainbows, this exaltation, that's a path to the God realm. That's not enlightenment. That's not actually realization. And so I got distracted by the dog, so I can't remember exactly what I was going to say. So I guess I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. And is there value in these kind of bigger retreats with tons of teachers arriving? Yes, there's definitely going to be value in there. But I think the way that they've gone about creating them, I've been invited to go teach at those. And I always end up thinking about it and sitting with it and deciding not to, because I feel like there isn't this spaciousness to digest the practice. And my teacher talks about like, you need to have space. You need to have that integration time for experiences. And that's slowing down, and that's giving yourself permission to do nothing for a while. Mm-hmm. And and that adrenaline rush, seeking out the new high, that like rainbow experience that you're talking about, like there isn't the spaciousness to really sit with an experience in there. And, you know, I come across a similar phenomenon when I'm coaching people in polyamory and non-monogamy. Like there's this kind of like addiction cycle that can happen of like, I need to get back into that new relationship energy. I need to get back into that sexual space with somebody. I need to get back into that experience and keep cultivating it. And it's like, well, what if you actually sit with what you have right now and really work on integrating that first?
I love that you said that. Sit with what you have right now and integrating that first, because that's such a Western thing, that seeking and collector, you know, just taking little bits and pieces and that seeking. That's such a Western thing because we haven't actually been taught how to just rest and be with ourselves.
It's
and that's something. Exactly. It's decolonizing. And the other thing I was going to say about like the Tantra festivals, which I've been invited to present at as well. And for me, it's like, you know, what would meet my need for integrity is if they called it a Neo-Tantra festival like that, you know, like that, my needs for that's why I keep calling out Neo-Tantra, quite frankly. I'll just let you all know, is because if you call it Neo-Tantra, then we know what the fuck we're dealing with. But when you just say Tantra, it's a complete misrepresentation. It's just not, it's a misrepresentation. So call it Neo-Tantra and I'll shut the fuck up. So that's all. We're asking for some integrity and accountability. Number one. Number two, the other thing that occurs to me is that the way we do Tantra is energy body yoga. That's what we're doing. We are working directly with the energy body for the purpose of clarifying it, purifying it, healing it, enriching it, enlightening it, quite literally. And you have to prepare the channels. You can't just boom. Yeah. So I'll give you an example of my own life and my own training is like, so I was being trained by my mentor who was like 20 years older than I was, had been practicing, you know, Neo-Tantra, Taoist practices, Indian-based Tantra before he encountered Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. And that was like missing link for him, right? And so he'd been practicing and cultivating the energy body yoga of Tibetan Buddhist Tantra for 5 years before he trained me. So he had a tremendous amount of, you know, potency in what he was doing. And he wanted to practice. So he was doing shit with me like that he should not have been doing in terms of working with my energy body. And so I just remember very clearly, like I was like, you know, having all these emotional breakdowns and reactions. And the Lama said to him, he's like, you're doing too much with her. Her energy body isn't prepared. You have to slow down. You have to prepare her channel. She can't handle that. And my mentor wanted to do this, like, you know, Dita yoga practice. And my Lama was like, no, not until she's accomplished Green Tara. You cannot do this sexual yoga practice with her until she has completed this non-sexual yoga practice. So her energy body is prepared for that increase in voltage of energy. That's the beauty of practicing under a lineage and with a Lama, is that you have that guidance, you have that wisdom and that like literal enlightened understanding to look at what's most appropriate for a student, and then can help like gauge and regulate how the information is being dispensed. And so with our school, one of the things that guidance that Lama Tashi gave us recently, because they had no idea that 5 elements have never been taught the way we're teaching them ever before. So, you know, Lama Tashi's like, go forth in the world and prosper. And, you know, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And so after a few years of being out here, what we're recognizing is that the Western nervous system and energy body has so much accumulated trauma in it that we're dropping this medicine in, and it's like, yeah. And not for everybody, but for people who haven't prepared the ground, so to speak, it can be explosive. And so Lama Tashi has given us some suggestions for adapting and changing and altering the way we deliver it, to titrate it, to make it potent, but less overwhelmingly so, right? Yeah. And so that's real Tantra. Tantra is energy body yoga. It's knowing that you're introducing medicine into your system, and that system needs to be able to absorb, digest, and metabolize it before you add more.
And what you're describing is a trauma-informed approach, because we don't want to overwhelm the nervous system. You know, I see people go to these tantric magic retreats and whatever, and they're, you know, we're going to do group masturbation and stuff like that. And that's overwhelming for the nervous system. And when the nervous system is overwhelmed, there's a kind of energetic fracturing that can happen.
Yes, thank you.
And there's a loss of self that can happen in there. That's where, control and manipulation can weave their way in. And that is not a good situation for anyone to find themselves in. And sometimes people don't even realize that they're the one who's trying to control another person, right? Like sometimes this stuff is happening on an unconscious level. And I think about the importance of breaking it down into simplicity. Like my teacher's been sharing some very simple teachings with us online recently. And one of the recent meditations was just about taking a step. A whole 10-minute meditation on taking a step and working with the awareness of the body and the energy that's happening in the body and visualizations to go with that, and working with, sacred mantra and just a single step. And to bring that level of mindfulness to a single step felt so nourishing. And I was thinking about how, when I used to be on retreat at the ashram, if people were having a mental health crisis, they were asked to go home because if you're in a mental health crisis, this is going to be too much. Like your nervous system's already dealing with so much, basically. And then I think about how many people get drawn into these Neo-Tantra spaces when they're going through crisis.
Yes. Yeah. And it makes them easy, like take advantage, right? It makes us easy to manipulate when we're broken seeking help. And that was me, broken seeking help. And we will take anything you say. We will do whatever you say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if there's like a cautionary thing for folks to take away from this, it's to, have discernment when you are choosing to follow a path. I mean, my teacher's teacher said, test your guru, test your teacher, test them. Don't just accept their word.
Yeah.
Maybe they're a good teacher, but they're not the right one for you, right? Like test them. And also, make sure that you are monitoring like your experience of it. Don't push yourself into it, and don't let anyone else push you into something that you're not ready to explore. Because I think the real medicine, the real healing happens when we slow down and don't push. Because that Western colonial mindset is what wants to push us. It's that colonization that pushed people out of Europe, and we have to achieve more and we have to learn more and we have to do more. And that's kind of how we get in this mess in the first place. So we have to counteract that.
Yeah.
And I hope there comes a day where we see the Neo-Tantra community at large start to acknowledge what its origins are, because they don't. No one wants to talk about that. When I've brought it up with Tantra teachers, they don't want to talk about Alistair Crowley or the omnipotent or, the handful of other white guys who were abusing boys and girls under the name of Tantra and sex magic rituals. Like nobody wants to talk about it. And I'm like, why?
And I'm going to invite our audience, do your homework and investigate. So it's Alistair Crowley and the Omnipotent And I'm going to share the links under this episode. I'm going to, on our blog at authentictantra.com, I'm going to share the links to those articles that you sent me, because buyer beware. This was a revelation for me. I just thought it was like, people, went to India and took stuff and then came back. I didn't realize that it was rooted in Satanism, satanic ritual. Like Alistair Crowley was a Satanist, right? And I mean,
dark
if that's
magic.
And if that's the roots, you've planted your tree in poison roots or in poison soil. And, we can transmute that stuff, but there's still going to be poison that leaches in to that. And we just look at the result. That's what my teacher says consistently. It's look at the result. What are the results? Are the results beneficial or are the results harmful? Yeah. Wow. Well, this is obviously something that I feel very passionately about.
Same.
Yeah. And then it's also, I think it's also something that causes confusion, is not just Neo-Tantra being packaged as Tantra, authentic Tantra, which it's not, but also that in traditional Tantra, there's so many different lineages and traditions. There's scholars in Kashmir Shaivism that know jack all about have never heard of the Shankar tradition. at all, right? And I'm very, very focused on my tradition. I didn't know about all these other traditions, and oh, they use the sex chakra too. I'm like, awesome. I didn't know that, because we're like my little blinders. But there's the realm of traditional lineage-based tantra is vast and rich.
And because there are so many teachers who have adapted it for the time that they're in.
Yes.
And they're like, I feel called to focus on this aspect of the teaching. I feel called to focus on this aspect of the teaching. My lineage talks about sex, and it talks about the sacredness of sexuality and the importance of preserving the male seed. But that's about all that goes into the public teachings, at least, and because that isn't the focus. And that's fine, because there's other branches of Tantra, real lineage-based Tantra, that do offer that for the people who want to and whose path that's part of. So, I think about like how we have so many different branches of Christianity, right? There's Lutheranism, there's Catholicism, there's Orthodox, there's everything. There's so many different kinds of Christianity. And I'd say it's comparable in that way, that there's so many different branches of Tantra, and they might be so different. They might seem sometimes to be in opposition to each other.
Yeah.
And I know, talking about our different lineages, there are parts where we're like, whoa, how does this come from the same origin? But they do, right? They share the same roots if we go back far enough. And I think that's, important to recognize that there's going to be an expression of true lineage Tantra that's going to resonate for each person.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you just have to put that intention out and go on that quest to seek it out. But there is so much richness and healing to be found. You don't need to go with the watered down, potentially harmful aspects of it.
So I think we've got a few minutes left. And so I wanted to ask you this question, because this is another one that I'm really confused about. When people say that they like that, so you said that your husband, your partner, wanted to have like tantric sex. Like, what do they mean by? Because I hear that's like, oh, it was very tantra like, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, because for me, tantra sex is really fucking complicated. Like when I'm doing really tantric sex, like it's amazing and ecstatic and whatever, but there's a lot of shit going on, like I described. So I'm so confused by what did your husband mean?
Well, it was this partner that I had. I think they had like some of Mantak Chia's books.
Oh, okay.
And they got me to read a part of a passage. I'm like, oh, it was so traumatizing to read this. And what I remember reading in there was that, maybe it wasn't Mantak Chia, maybe it was somebody else. But what I remember reading in there was that the man and the woman, because it's very cis heteronormative, the man and the woman have to orgasm at the same time. And the woman is not allowed to, she's not allowed to climax until the man climaxes. And so like it was this explanation of like a valley orgasm, like you would get to a peak and then you'd have to take it away and then get to another peak and take it away and get to another peak and take it away. And it was practicing that actually left me with sexual trauma.
Dude, that doesn't sound like Taoist sexuality to me. From what I've read about Taoist sexuality, it's like how many orgasms she can have, a million to fucking make her come and come. And only when she says you can you stop, because you're not even supposed to be ejaculating, motherfucker. Not all ever.
Yeah.
So don't do it unless you're trying to have a baby.
So, I mean, that was just one passage of a book that this partner had me read. And I don't know what else is out there, but I know that it definitely never felt that kind of like, like I look at that Alex Gray art. I know you guys have that same print in your house too. And, that's the aspiration for what tantric sex is going to feel like, this transcendent energy cycling. And I've had that experience with partners, with multiple different partners, and it's beautiful and incredible and nothing at all like what this book was trying to encourage it to be.
But even like having transcendent amazing experiences isn't necessarily tantric sex. Like again, tantra, it's something you do. Like, again, my indoctrination or entrainment in it is energy body yoga. So I can be making love with my husband, and it can be great and expansive and wonderful. And it's gonna build upon our non-sexual and sexual tantra practice. But when we are practicing sexual tantra, we are doing a very specific series of methods and practices that can then be translated to ordinary sex too. But it's just because it's expanded sex doesn't mean it's tantra. Expanded sex, feeling all connected and one with the universe, that's just your birthright. That's called normal sex. That's called natural human sex. That's what we're supposed to be having.
There's a lot of practices that I think get pulled into Neo-Tantra that are just like basic health things that are good. Like, let's work on releasing our pelvic floor and like not holding all that chronic tension in our psoas from how chronically stressed and traumatized we are. That's probably a good thing. Breath work, probably a good thing to do as a human being. You can bring that into the sexual space or not, right? Like they're all elements that are healthy and worthy and worthwhile doing. But are they part of Tantra?
What is your lineage and who is your teacher? That's what it boils down to. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been an enlivening conversation and probably very triggering in some ears, but I'm okay with that. So we're no strangers to that. Thank you, Mel. This is so fun.
Thank you, Devi. I always love chatting with you.
Likewise. So you audience, you have been enlightened. I'm going to leave links, as I said, under this video on our blog at authentictantra.com, hopefully on YouTube too. So you can read more about the roots of Neo-Tantra. It's good to know. Doesn't mean you can't ever enjoy Neo-Tantra. Just know what you're doing, right? Know where it came from. And so that can, I think that can help like navigate that. Like, if you kind of, forewarned is forearmed.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. Yay. Yeah, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. Make sure that you stay connected with Mel at, what is your website again?
radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca.
radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca, and follow her on Instagram for all of her amazing wisdom coming down the pipeline. And you have an event coming up soon, yeah?
My monogamy detox course starts October 7th.
Okay. All right. So go to radicalrelating.ca and check out that course, Monogamy Detox. And you can stay connected with us between shows at authentictantra.com, online, and Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the major outlets. And make sure that you give a shout out to our marketing director, Brian Craig, who is holding it down and spreading the good word of the Institute online and everywhere he can. So have a beautiful night. Take care. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Sex is Medicine with Devi Ward Erickson, your #1 resource for holistic sex education. You can listen to and subscribe to Sex is Medicine on Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Just search Sex is Medicine with Devi Ward. Stay connected with me and my guests on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Authentic Tantra, and learn how you can use Tantra as medicine to heal, awaken, and empower every area of your life at authentictantra.com. Make sure to tune in to Sex is Medicine every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific on Contact Talk Radio Network, and join our watch party every Thursday evening on Facebook at Authentic Tantra. We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of Sex is Medicine with Devi Ward.